Hey patrons, welcome to the Q&A video for May 2018. We've got a bunch of questions this month. They're actually all pretty good, so I'm actually going to try and get to every single one of them. So with that said, let's dive in and start getting you some answers. Okay, kicking off this month, Brandon asks, when did you learn to draw? Did you ever go to art school? And how did you decide on what your art style would be? So tackling those in order, when did I learn to draw? I'm still learning, is the most honest answer I can give. I mean, it's a little, I guess it's a little bit silly, but it's the truth. You never really stop learning. I started drawing when I was very, very little. I've kind of, for all of my conscious memory, I've been into drawing and art and comic books and wanting to do that, like loving comic books and wanting to be able to do that same thing. That was kind of what, from a very young age, what spurred me into art was, not painting or classical art in that sense. I wanted to do comic books. I didn't exactly go to art school specifically. I've obviously taken a variety of different classes and courses throughout my life. I did actually start college, for art in a way, but that was really geared towards graphic design. So I was taking art classes, but my major was graphic design, which obviously I dropped out when I started the comic strip, or rather when the comic strip took off. And in terms of deciding, what my art style would be, that's one of those things that I don't really think you get. I mean, unless you're sitting down to very specifically emulate, a particular artist or style. An artist's given style is something that just sort of develops organically. And that's not to say that I haven't, looked to different art styles for inspiration. I can tell you right now, throughout the 90s, I was dead set on drawing like Todd McFarlane, Spawn and Greg Capullo. So if you look at some of my art from way back then, it has very much that kind of a style. And even nowadays, if I'll be watching a cartoon or something and I'll see, just little things like a way they'll draw a piece of clothing, like a wrinkle or an ear or this or that, and think like, oh, I kind of like that. And so bits of that work its way into my artwork, and then what you would consider my style evolves that way, and it's kind of pulled from a lot of different things that I like and the way I like things to look and that sort of thing. Next up, Isaac asks, how are you living vicariously through your son? Isaac, I live vicariously through through both of my boys in pretty much any way possible. The toys, the TV, like the cartoons, the TV, just all of it. Their experiences, watching them see things for the first time that I take for granted, and just going forward, I'm we're not there yet. They're still too little, but being able to share the Marvel Cinematic Universe with them, Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, all of that stuff. I mean, that is all definitely stuff that I'm psyched about and I'm looking forward to. But just pretty much in any way possible, in terms of reliving my childhood, having an excuse to play with toys again and action figures and play pretend or play guys, which is what me and my sister used to call it when we were little. It would be like, do you want to play guys? And that would be playing with our various figures and stuff. 100%, any way I can get it, I'm kind of reliving my childhood with them. Okay, Bram, to switch things up a little bit to something with a more serious tone, Bram asks a question that he prefaced with a lot of information, and it involves loot boxes and regulatory agencies that either have or are in the process of classifying video game loot boxes as gambling, and putting different regulations and restrictions on that. His question specifically for me is, do you consider loot boxes gambling, and should it be prohibited for minors? So I do actually consider loot boxes gambling, in that I believe it triggers the same things as like a slot machine or other types of gambling do in the in the subconscious, that little dopamine rush, that that thought that the odds can fall in your favor and you'll get the big prize and that sort of thing. I do think it's very similar. I think that it's, but I really would only classify it as gambling if you're actually paying money for the loot box. So if you're purchasing the loot box with money rather than just experience or a currency that you earn in a video game, then I would liken it to gambling. Like I said, if it's just part of the game, like a way the game distributes its rewards, and there's no exchange of money involved, then it's really just a different way for the game to give you rewards. Very similar to like a random drop from an enemy. And I do feel like loot boxes should be in some way regulated, for minors. I mean, if it's an exchange of money thing, then you would think that the restrictions would come into place in terms of like, how do they have a credit card? They would have to access their parents' credit card and that sort of thing. But I do think with the correlation between purchasing a loot box and getting in-game loot and like I mentioned, the rush that comes with that, I think the kids maybe don't necessarily have the perspective to view that for what it is and to really match the correlation between the money that they're spending for this virtual item, the thrill of it, but also when to limit it, when to say, okay, we tried a couple, that's enough. I think it'd be much easier for kids to just keep pulling that lever, so to speak. So personally, I find loot boxes to be, pretty obnoxious. I mean, if they're just cosmetic stuff, I have no problem with their existence. Money-based or otherwise. But as a whole, I'm sick of hearing about them in the industry. I'm glad to hear that, the whole Battlefront 2 fiasco has scared developers a little bit away from, the ridiculous loot box everything thing. So I'd be perfectly happy if this fad just went away entirely. But we'll see what happens going forward, I guess. Dave wants to know, with the reboot, is there a chance that we'll learn what Ted has been up to? I can give you a very simple answer to that, Dave. I've actually not even decided whether or not Ted will be a character in the reboot. He's not in any of my immediate plans. I haven't ruled it out. I mean, if I found a way that to kind of bring a penguin back into the story that felt like more than just a cheesy cameo for the sake of the cameo, then I might consider it. But as of now, I have no plans as such. We've got another reboot-related question from Keenan, who asks, with the reboot, do you have plans on telling or showing how Scott, Lucas, and Ethan got together and met? 100% I do have plans to do that. How I'm going to do it, I haven't quite decided yet. So, that sort of thing, that sort of backstory, that sort of exposition, I feel needs to come, in an appropriate conversation, which would be like, I don't picture those three sitting around having a beer necessarily for no reason, recounting the circumstances in which they all came to be friends and know each other. But if there was an outsider, for instance, somebody that didn't know the group, and was getting to know them, then that might come out naturally through the course of conversation. However, I do also have this one idea that I've been kicking around, and I've kind of been outlining this, and what that is basically Analog and D-Pad Year One, modeled after the concept of like Batman Year One, which was a series that showed Batman's very first year as the Batman, and what that looked like, and because we started Analog and D-Pad like a year in, Ethan and Lucas had already established themselves a little bit, in this routine of being superheroes, running the game store, that sort of thing. And one thing I'd like to do is go back and pick up from the night that they got their powers and just show the immediate aftermath in its entirety, not just through snippets of flashbacks and conversation about remember that time when. So I'd kind of been thinking maybe I would write like a 3 to 5 issue mini-series, called Analog and D-Pad Year One, price it out, and then take it to Kickstarter to see if I could get enough backing to get that made, because that would be something, like kind of like an additional project So I'd look for an artist, a colorist, and I would just write it, and I would have somebody else do the artwork while I continue to work on the main series, as we go forward. And then so that would be a way to kind of show you the direct aftermath of everything. And then in the main series, like, they might once in a while reference stuff, but you'd be able to say, like, okay, yeah, I remember that from their first year, and it wouldn't require as much of a burden on the main series to fill in all of those gaps. But regardless, either way, whichever way I end up going with it, it's definitely something that's going to be explored. It has to be explored because the nature of their dynamic and how they met, that sort of thing, it's all very important to who they are and the situation that they're in. So rest assured that will get explored over time. Edward asks, given that we've had many different universes in your comics telling different stories, I'm curious as to what your decision-making process to decide which kind of story you plan to tell. How do you decide which storylines to expand while others have been dropped? That's just really comes down to feeling, in a way. How do I feel about it? Does telling this story excite me? Does it make me, am I anxious to get it out, to tell this story? Do I think it's something that either hasn't been told before or hasn't been told in this particular way before? Even if it's a story that's been done before, is there something that I can add to it to make it my own, that sort of thing? And then certainly there have been things where I've kind of started it and realized, I'm not all that interested in it. It's like the inspiration fades, and maybe, what I thought was a good idea didn't really blossom into, something sustainable. And I think, to a small degree, some of it is, is reaction. Like I might be excited about something, and if I put it out there and it receives kind of a tepid response, that might temper my enthusiasm for it a little bit. So it's a variety of things, but it really just comes down to a feeling and, what is it that's making me excited to get up in the morning and come into the office and put pen to paper, so to speak. Roderick asks, how do you color the lighting in Starcaster number 5 and 6? Well, Roderick, I didn't color number 5. Davi colored that one, a colorist that I've used in the past. I paid him to color it. I am coloring Starcaster number 6. And as far as doing lighting like that, the lantern orb, that sort of thing, it's really just a number of layers. Building up, the shadows and the highlights on multiple layers to get those glow effects and the light bouncing off the different surfaces and that sort of thing. It's really just a step-by-step process. But I'm glad you like it. And finally this month, Steven asks, how often do you get surprised by fan reaction to things you probably thought were relatively minor touches? Such as the request for Court's t-shirt from this most recent issue of Starcaster Chronicles. I would say fairly often I get surprised. I tend to set my expectations pretty low in that regard. I don't go into that sort of thing thinking, here's a t-shirt, like, I hope I can turn this into merchandise. It was more just like, my character's putting on a t-shirt, let me come up with some funky sci-fi logo that, because, like, again, it just I think it just adds to the world, like, seeing logos and, graphic t-shirts and posters and stuff like that, as opposed to just a blank design. So yeah, so my reaction is always when someone's like, oh, can we get that on a t-shirt? It's always it's kind of like, really? Okay. I'm happy to oblige, but yeah, I don't tend to go into things like that. And it's the same even if I actually create a poster for the purpose of selling it, or a t-shirt for the purpose of selling it. I tend to try and just set my expectations pretty low, and then because then that way you can be pleasantly surprised if it's popular, and if it's not popular, you didn't have your hopes up, I guess. But I also think that's just a byproduct of sort of the way I approach my business as a whole. Going out 3 times a week, putting a comic out, you can't go out there thinking like, yeah, this one's going to be super popular, it's going to be really funny, everybody's going to love this, because you don't know. Like, I know what I find funny and interesting and that sort of thing, but there are so many people that read the comic and with all sorts of different personal experiences, and it's all subjective and that sort of thing. So I'm constantly having things that I think are really funny kind of fall flat, and also things that where I'm like, oh, this idea is kind of meh, but let me just put it out there, and it's like incredibly popular. So, I've learned to just sort of, like I said, rein in expectations and that sort of thing. Okay, that was a lot of questions, but thank you so much for asking them. I have a lot of fun answering these for you guys. I appreciate all of your continued support. You guys are awesome. You guys are definitely making all of this possible for me, and I'm incredibly grateful for it. So thank you again, and we will see you in June.